presentation for about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Michelle Rojas-Tal. I'll say a few more words about her then to introduce her, and she'll take it from there, and then we'll have some time for questions. As with last week, I'm going to ask you to write questions in the chat box, and we will read them out after we've both spoken. So you can do that whilst the presentations are going on, or as you wish. And yeah, I think it's going to be some interesting topics. That these kinds of issues, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, tend to arouse quite a lot of interest and passions, understandably. It's a shame that they're such current issues, but there you go. So I'm going to do a screen share and start with my presentation. Just bear with me. Okay. So what I want to do is focus on the question of anti-Zionism and its connection to anti-Semitism, and I'm going to use as a sort of case study, if you like, Jeremy Corbyn's tenure as leader of the Labour Party in the UK. Those that don't know, but you can hear from my accent, that is originally where I'm from. And so even though I've been living in Israel for nearly 13 years, the events of the political events of my old country have had me quite riled up at times. Now, there is, I would say, a widely shared view among many Jews, and certainly I think most Israeli Jews, that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic, that essentially if you're anti-Zionist, you are in fact an anti-Semite. There's also a widely shared view among many Western journalists and academics and politicians, particularly, but not only those on the left, that anti-Zionism is not necessarily anti-Semitic. In fact, that it usually isn't, because many of them are anti-Zionists and they don't want to be considered anti-Semitic. So what I want to do is think about it in two different ways. One is anti-Zionism that serves to open the door to unambiguous anti-Semitism, which is the gateway drug analogy that I use, and anti-Zionism that is itself a recognizable form, a new form, if you like, of anti-Semitism. Let's very quickly define what we mean by anti-Zionism, and let's dismiss straight away the most common straw man argument that you hear. Anti-Zionism is the hatred of Israel as the Jewish state or a wish for it to disappear or be destroyed, and it is not criticism of the Israeli government or particular policies of the Israeli government. Right? This is the argument you often hear from the other side, and we'll get to that. So let's look at anti-Zionism as a gateway drug, the idea that anti-Zionism sort of leads to anti-Semitism. Now, in a way, that's counterintuitive, right? It makes more sense to assume that you start with a hatred of Jews, and then that leads to a hatred of the Jewish state. But instead, we can actually see the reverse happening. We have Zionism equals racism or imperialism, and that whole movement, especially the anti-imperialist left, seizing on the establishment of Israel in 1948. Please note, not 1967 and the Palestinians, the occupation, all that stuff, but the establishment of Israel itself in 1948, that's seen as the ultimate example of the continued presence of colonialism and imperialism in our time. And from that anti-Israel sentiment, you get anti-Semitism in all its different guises. Now, what Jeremy Corbyn spells leader of the Labour Party provides, I think, is actually a very useful test case. It's like getting a petri dish and putting into it an ideological anti-Zionist and his fellow travellers, and seeing what happens when they take over a mainstream, politically moderate institution, and specifically seeing what is the effect on how that party treats Jews. So let me say a word first about Corbyn himself. Not everyone, certainly not many people outside the United Kingdom, know who he is. He was largely unknown outside Britain until he became the leader of the opposition, until he took over the Labour Party. This is a man who spent his entire parliamentary career obsessed with Israel. There was a study done by the Jewish News in London, which found that as a backbencher, as a regular member of parliament, he submitted more motions for debate on Israel than on any other single topic. When he was first elected to parliament in 1983, a Jewish journalist and Labour Party member said that he wrote that thanks to Corbyn's backing for policies that would effectively mean, quote, the destruction of Israel, he could not bring himself to vote for his own party's candidate. This was Corbyn at the very beginning of his political career, and he basically stayed in that place from then on, from 1983 onwards. I want to quote for you a British Jewish expert on left-wing anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, called David Hirsch, who writes something about Corbyn, which I think is particularly useful. He says, Corbyn's political tradition understands the key evils on the planet to be American, British, and Israeli imperialism. He thinks that forces which oppose imperialism, including Iran, Iraqi Islamist militias, bin Laden, the IRA, Hamas, and Hezbollah, are fundamentally defensive, and he supports them insofar as they are anti-imperialist. Now, this is the worldview of a significant part of the left. I think 20 years ago we could say restricted more to the far left. Unfortunately, it's become more mainstream, I think, in recent years, not just restricted to the UK, of course. In the US, you can see the same sort of thing from the likes of Noam Chomsky, Judith Butler, and more recently, people like Lynn Sarsour, who expressed a very similar kind of mindset. So to go back to the question, what happens when that kind of man, when that kind of worldview takes over the Labour Party? And we have the answer. We have an absolute epidemic of anti-Semitism in the party. It became a political party that was labelled institutionally anti-Semitic and was under investigation by Britain's Equalities and Human Rights Commission. Just to give a sense of how serious that is, up to that point, the only time a political party in Britain had been subject to that kind of investigation, it was the British National Party, basically the descendant of the neo-Nazi parties in Britain, where, run by men that used to spend their teenage years shaved-headed, chasing Jews and blacks around with baseball bats. So this began with a hatred of Israel, but it led to incidents which had nothing to do with Israel, right? So the Twitter and Facebook accounts of ordinary Labour Party members and some elected officials became forums of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, Holocaust denial, innuendo about wealthy Jewish bankers, things which had absolutely nothing to do with Israel. And when Israel was brought into the conversation, it was with no just cause. So you would have Jewish Labour MPs accused of being Mossad agents or receiving their orders from the Israeli embassy, including Jewish MPs that weren't even particularly pro-Israel. So that the party developed an anti-Semitism problem is not in doubt, and neither is the fact that the problem started, or at least became too big a problem to ignore, within a couple of months of Corbyn becoming leader of the party. So in the case of the Labour Party, I think it's unarguable that whether or not anti-Zionism is itself anti-Semitic, and we'll get onto that, once you start singling out and demonizing the Jewish state, once that becomes legitimate, then people that have that inclination to do the same thing to Jewish people are encouraged and empowered to do so. And there's one more aspect to this gateway drug analogy. One, it's we're talking about the Labour Party as an institution, but with the case of individuals, you can see the same sort of graduation to the harder stuff of clear, unambiguous anti-Semitism. So if you look at Corbyn himself, this is a man who had no obvious animus towards the Jewish religion or to the Jews as a people. This isn't someone who was attracted to, far-right ideology or older Christian anti-Semitism or anything like that. He had this obsessive hostility towards Israel. And that created this blind spot with regards to anti-Semitism. So we have a long record of his support for individuals who he defined as critics of Israel, but who in reality, a collection of Holocaust deniers, blood libelers, and actual Jew murdering terrorists like Hamas. Some of you may have seen this clip.
But I want to first of all say thank you everyone for being here tonight. and say that tomorrow evening it will be my pleasure and my honour to host an event in Parliament where our friends from Hezbollah will be speaking. I've also invited friends from Hamas from the stage as well. Unfortunately, the Israelis would not allow them to travel here, so it's going to be only friends from Hezbollah. So far as I'm concerned, that is absolutely the right function of using parliamentary facilities to invite people from other parts of the world.
And let's all applaud. So, you know, that's Jeremy Corbyn as a backbench MP a few years before becoming leader of the Labour Party. You know, that was him then, and that was him after becoming leader. A lot of other things came out of the closet, came out of his particular skeletons in his particular closet. There was a mural which I think you can see depicts Jewish caricatured bankers playing Monopoly on the backs of poor people, which he defended. There was a revelation that came out actually relatively recently, or at the end of his time as leader, where he wrote a glowing foreword to a book written at the beginning of the 20th century by a fanatical anti-Semite, who it was ostensibly a book about economics, but in the book the author writes about men of a single and peculiar race who have behind them many centuries of financial experience and are in a unique position to control the policy of nations. And if we're not entirely sure who he's talking about, he then talks about the House of Rothschild, etc. And Corbyn writes in his foreword simply that the book is brilliant and correct and prescient, and makes no mention of any problematic or offensive or racist elements in the book. Now, I don't think Corbyn is a genuine believer in protocols of the elders of Zion. I just think he doesn't see anti-Semitism. Jews aren't on his radar as a discriminated minority. They're white, they're Western, at least in his limited imagination, and they can't possibly be victims of racism. Victims of racism are usually poor, they have dark skin, they are the victims of imperialism. This is the mindset. So when anti-Semitism is alleged at him or one of his friends, it doesn't compute, right? So it must be a bad faith accusation, and it's an attempt to shut down criticism of Israel. So we can look at his friendship and defense of this gentleman on the right here, the one without the beard, Reverend Stephen Sizer, who's an Anglican clergyman who likes to hang out with Holocaust deniers and has publicly inquired as to whether Israel was responsible for 9/11. And Corbyn wrote a letter to the Church of England defending his friend from accusations of anti-Semitism. And he says that Sizer was simply highlighting the injustices of the Palestinian-Israeli situation, and he requested that any judgment of Sizer note, quote, just how much distance exists between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, right? Of course, they can't possibly be the same thing. By the way, if you don't know, the other guy in the picture is Raed Salah, an Israeli Arab Islamist, blood libeler and inciter to violence and terrorism, who's was spent time in Israeli prison. I think he might still be in Israeli prison, who Corbyn also invited to tea at House of Commons when he visited. When Jonathan Arkush, the president of the Board of Deputies, which is the most senior elected Jewish community position in the country, accused Corbyn of anti-Semitism, a spokesman for Corbyn responded that Jonathan Arkush's attempt to conflate strong criticism of Israeli state policy with anti-Semitism is wrong. Now, he'd be right if that's what Arkush was doing, but Arkush wasn't claiming that criticism of Israeli policies is anti-Semitism. He was saying that delegitimizing the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. Delegitimization is not the same as criticizing policies, and it seems that delegitimization is only reserved for Israel. So is Corbyn anti-Semitic? I think a strong case can be made that Corbyn's career-long contempt for Israel has morphed over time into something much more extensive. One way I think we can illustrate this is, let's do a sort of thought experiment. If you imagine that we're not talking about Corbyn, and we're not talking about the Labour Party, but we're talking about some hypothetical leader of a major political party in a major Western democracy. And let's imagine that the accusation is not anti-Semitism, but is racism against black people. Okay, so this leader, let's say, before he became leader, had multiple meetings with and defended the reputations of members of the Ku Klux Klan and European neo-Nazis and referred to them as his friends. Let's say he appeared at the memorial ceremony for a white supremacist mass murderer and laid a wreath at his grave. Let's imagine he defended the painting of a public mural of black people depicted as monkeys. Let's say that he wrote a foreword to a book that promotes racist tropes about black people, and then he called the book brilliant. And then let's imagine that anti-black racism soared to epidemic levels in his party under his leadership. Now, does anyone imagine that such a man would not universally be called a racist and be forced to resign? I think you get my point, and I think you can see not just the nature of the anti-Semitism, but also the hypocrisy and the double standard that was at play in Britain with Corbyn's reign. Okay, so Corbyn, the committed anti-Zionist, is, I think, an anti-Semite. Can we then say anti-Zionism is itself a form of anti-Semitism? Always. So I want to identify three stages of anti-Zionism, historic stages of anti-Zionism, developments, if you like, over time. So let's say the first stage predates Israel and is the belief that Zionism was simply the wrong answer to the Jewish question in Europe. And this was a belief that was held by a lot of Jews, perhaps the majority of Jews, until the 1930s, when it became clear that there was no future for them in Europe after Hitler came to power. But a lot of these Jews thought that it was better to trust in the promise of further emancipation or to support the utopian vision that was offered by socialism, rather than jump into the Zionist idea of upping sticks and moving to the Holy Land of Israel. And it can be understood, I think, that position in the context of the time, although history proved it catastrophically wrong. But it wouldn't be fair, I think, to regard that phase of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic. Second phase of anti-Zionism, we can say, is in the early years of the state, the movement, primarily by the Arab states, to destroy Israel in the years following its creation. And again, I'm not sure that was motivated primarily by the fact that the state of Israel was Jewish. That can be debated, and there's been books written arguing about the anti-Semitism of certain Islamist factions among the Arab nations in 1948. But I think more than the Jewish character was the fact that this was a Western implant in the Arab world, that this was a country that was not Arab and not Muslim, and perhaps the fact that it was Jewish didn't help. But I'm not sure that anti-Semitism was the main driver. But then we get to the final stage, which is the stage that we live with today, which was this idea started in the 1970s, pushed by the Soviet Union, that Israel should be removed, not only because it was some kind of imperialist sore in the Arab world, but that it was a uniquely malign force in the world, and that it was representative of all that was wrong in the world, and that the worst sins of racism and human rights abuse could be ascribed to Israel. And we see this, of course, most, I think, prominently these days in parts of the UN Human Rights Commission, for example. And we can actually look back to when this started at the UN in 1975, when what became known as the Zionism is Racism Resolution was passed by the UN General Assembly, determining that Zionism is a form of racism. You can see it here listed amongst forms of racism. And this was an initiative of the Soviet Union, and it would become the inspiration for what would develop into an essential part of the left worldview. Now, I could quote a lot of amazing passages in two absolutely brilliant speeches, which you can look up, from Israeli Ambassador Chaim Herzog, here on the left, or the American Ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan. But I want to read you something instead from a more neutral source, if you like. And this is the British writer and academic Goronwy Rees, not Jewish, not someone with any kind of brief for supporting Israel or supporting Jews. And he was an observer of the debate on Resolution 3379 in the Third Committee of the General Assembly. And he said this. He said, there were ghosts haunting the Third Committee that day. The ghosts of Hitler and Goebbels and Julius Streicher, grinning with delight to hear not only Israel, but Jews as such denounced in language which would have provoked hysterical applause at any Nuremberg rally. So from the beginning, this attack on Zionism and the claim that Israel was born in sin, in irredeemable sin, was felt to be about something more than just geopolitics. Rees and other people who saw this couldn't help but note that the Jewish right to self-determination, something that had been lauded as a sign of progress and justice in the years following the Holocaust, was now being defined as racism. And curiously, only the Jewish right to self-determination was defined in that way. And this accusation came from the left was even more curious. Now, there was a time when socialists and communists were generally opposed to all kinds of nationalism, right? They were utopian universalists, and they weren't applying a different standard to Jews. It would be hard to argue that an anti-Zionist was an anti-Semite if he was against all nationalisms, right? If he was against nationalism on principle, and he wasn't just singling out the Jews. But by 1975, when the UN passed this resolution, the left were the main supporters of a whole range of post-colonial people's struggles to establish independent nation states. Algerians, Vietnamese, Palestinians. Now, if you say this to someone who's an anti-Zionist, they'll say, but it was different, right? Because when Israel was established, it displaced another people. That's the problem, right? That's the original sin. The problem is, of course, with that argument, that Zionism itself didn't displace anyone. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Arab population of Palestine actually increased through immigration from neighboring countries. The British Peel Commission noted that Arabs from Syria and elsewhere had been attracted to Palestine by the improved living standards brought about by, wait for it, the Zionist immigration from Europe. The state of Israel had already been established before any Palestinians were displaced. So it's simply incorrect to say that Israel's creation required or necessitated the displacement of the Palestinians. Now, there was a displacement in the war that followed Israel's establishment, a war that was forced on Israel, but it was hardly unique in state creation, especially at that time. In fact, just 1 year earlier, in 1947, the partition of India created a displacement of millions, many, many millions of people, right? A displacement that dwarfs the Palestinian experience by an order of magnitude. But when did you last read a debate of any kind on the right of Pakistan to exist? Right? A country, as it happens, that has a human rights record objectively much more egregious than Israel's. Now, I want to wrap up because I want to make sure that we have time to hear Michelle and questions. I think that I will just say that the European left critique these days is often bound up with sympathy for Arabs and Muslims. At least that's what they say, right? So in Europe, you'd often hear Muslims being referred to as the new Jews because of Islamophobia, as it's called. So here's something strange. Muslims have been the victims of genuine, horrific atrocities in very recent times. If you're familiar with what's going on in parts of Asia, the Rohingya Muslims of Burma have been brutally ethnically cleansed. In China, there are these re-education camps, and when any totalitarian regime wants to re-educate you, you should probably run. But I think, millions of Muslims in parts of China are being re-educated, essentially having their religion forced out of them, children separated from their parents, really horrific stuff. And yet the left-wing organizations and public figures that are so skilled at organizing mass demonstrations against Israel haven't said a word about this, right? So I think it's impossible to ignore that there seems to be something uniquely thrilling about protesting Israel, and only Israel. And we have to ask ourselves what that is, what makes Israel unique. And really, the only thing that makes Israel truly unique is it's the world's only Jewish state. And that speaks to something pathological, I think, in Western society, maybe in European society particularly. I'll conclude with this. I don't think all anti-Zionists, individual anti-Zionists, hate Jews, but they all participate today in a discourse that's completely contaminated by anti-Semitism. It's not rational, but anti-Zionist forums and chat rooms also include an awful lot of discussion about how Jews ran the slave trade or the influence of the Rothschilds on global politics. And it's still not clear what it is about Jewish statehood that they find so uniquely objectionable, and what it is about Israel's policies or actions that make the state itself, not this or that government, illegitimate. And then what do they think when they talk about, Israel, that it shouldn't be a Jewish state? It's not clear what they think would be the fate of Israel's 7 million or so Jews in this post-state scenario. I'm not sure if they're imagining sort of Arab majority liberal democracy, because if you look around the Middle East, that scenario doesn't seem too likely. So I'll end with Jeremy Corbyn and his merry gang, who are happily no longer running Britain's main opposition party. But these are people who will deny relentlessly that they're anti-Semitic. And most of them even deny they're against Israel. They'll just say they're against Israeli policies. But if you listen carefully, you'll notice that the only Israel they'll accept is one without a Jewish character. And the only two-state solution that they'll support is one with a full right of return of the alleged 5 million or so descendants of Palestinian refugees. In other words, a two-state solution which would establish one Palestinian state alongside another Palestinian state. Anti-Zionism, certainly the type that has predominated over the last 40 years, inevitably provides cover and support for overt Jew haters. And by holding Israel to a different standard than everyone else, anti-Zionism renders the Jewish state as representative of the historic figure of the Jew, singled out for prejudice and persecution. And that is textbook anti-Semitism. I will conclude there. So I'm going to stop this screen sharing. Okay. Right, I hope that was interesting and informative and useful. And I now want to introduce our second speaker for the evening, Michelle Rojas-Tal, who is the Central Shlicha to Hillel International and Director of the Jewish Agency Israel Fellows Program, which is a program that supports Jewish college students in today's hostile and challenging environment by providing a dynamic and engaging Israeli presence on campus. In partnership with Hillel, with the world's largest Jewish campus organization, there are currently nearly 80 Israel Fellows on North American campuses. The program also operates across Europe, South Africa, Australia, and Latin America. Michelle made Aliyah in July of 2007, joining the international team of Stand With Us as Diaspora Education Director. She's traveled to Switzerland, Hong Kong, South Africa, Turkey, Greece, North America, and Australia in her position, and has been featured as a keynote speaker at numerous conferences and forums. In May of 2013, Michelle was featured as part of Jerusalem Post's list of influential Jews and as one of the 6 women to watch in the Jewish world. And she's currently living in the greater DC area with her husband and 2 daughters. And I'll just say on a personal note, she's a good friend. And I'm waiting for her to come back to Israel so we can go for coffee. Hopefully we'll be able to go for coffee when she's back. And Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paul. So good evening, good afternoon, everyone, for anyone sharing a similar time zone with me. I'm very happy to be here, as Paul mentioned, not only with a close colleague, but a wonderful friend. I think most like-minded people made Aliyah during the same year, so we are both approaching very soon our 13th year, our bar mitzvah year of Aliyah. Nearly 3 years ago, as Paul mentioned, I came out as the central emissary of the Jewish Agency on behalf of the Jewish Agency to Hillel International to lead the Israel Fellows Program on college campuses here. And as Paul shared, we have nearly 80 emissaries that served close to 140 different Hillel bodies and functions here in North America, and one Chabad that we had a partnership program with Chabad that is continuing at WashU. So it's a very dynamic and interesting time to obviously be having this conversation, namely because we see the activities still continuing of the forces that are not too friendly towards our community or towards Israel, even in our new virtual reality that we're all living in, and I'll touch on that in just a second. So what I'd like to kind of move into a bit, given the incredible background that I think Paul shared with us and where it kind of met each of us in terms of our own knowledge base and connection to this very pertinent issue, is to really understand the importance, I think, namely of what the Israel Fellows are doing today on college campuses and what many of our partner organizations are doing, which is actually bringing this issue front and center from a very educational and engaging approach to an audience that simply has no idea. What we find, particularly here in the United States over the past few years, is what many have referred to as a horseshoe of anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist activity, meaning it's coming from the far left and the far right. So we have experienced over the past few months incidences of white supremacy on college campus, all the way to more extreme activities of the likes of Students for Justice in Palestine and the Muslim Brotherhood. So we see it coming from both ends in certain places. Now, I want to take us all back, and I know, Paul, at the very beginning, you touched on what I think is a constant conversation and discourse for so many of us, which is really the deep understanding of anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism and that almost litmus test that we are facing. Now, Natan Sharansky, who is the visionary of the Israel Fellows Program, and who really made the program what it is today, but as we all know, just an incredible figure and hero amongst the Jewish community, amongst the Zionist community as well. Natan, if many of you will remember, created the formula, the 3Ds formula, which I think is absolutely still relevant today when we're looking at truly understanding and diving into the difference between when something is legitimate critique of Israel versus when it is crossing over into anti-Semitism. So the 3Ds, as a reminder, are demonization, demonizing Israel as the Jewish state, and using imagery and language that really is very reminiscent of blood libel, old-fashioned anti-Semitism that is very easily identified. Delegitimization, which is a word that I find very funny simply because we use the same exact word in Hebrew. And if there's one Hebrew word that's basically impossible to say for me and for many of us, it is delegitimization in Hebrew. But delegitimizing, as Paul so rightly pointed out, the one Jewish state there is in the world. If individuals choose to take on the concept of nationalistic states, let's have that discourse, right? Agree, disagree, it's all relevant. But when you look at the one Jewish state, opposed to Turkey, which defines itself as a Muslim democracy, or the United Kingdom, where the Queen is the head of the state, but she's also head of the Church of England, right? And if we look at some of the symbols and language being used by those countries, by Western democracies, I'm very much a fervent advocate of not comparing Israel to Middle Eastern theocratic regimes. I feel very strongly about it. Israel is not a theocracy. We do not have any desire to become a theocracy. And so I think it's a mistake. But where we do need to have the legitimate conversation is where we're talking about other Western nations and if and where they are not being held to the same standard. Gil Troy, I remember many years ago, Gil Troy is a mentor. My personal mentor, and Gil had said to me, it's not a double standard, it is a third standard, simply because having a double standard means someone else is being held to a similar scenario or standard, and here Israel simply is not. So delegitimization, demonization, and the final one being double standards, as I mentioned. So Israel being held or being expected to be held to a standard that, quite frankly, no other nation is being held to. So this, I think, is a critical litmus test for all of us as individuals who are passionate about this issue and involved in it on different levels, that we are able to keep in our mindset as we're having this conversation. Because quite frankly, as you know, Paul, this is an incredibly critical platform for us as a community to continue to recharge ourselves and understand what the most current issues are and be best educated. But the individuals we need to reach out on are not on this phone call, and they're not in any of the forums that we put together as a community. And so what we see in particular in our work is a lot of that reaching out in particular to non-Jewish students on college campuses, because they are the next generation. What we have seen, and I'm sure many of you are very, very aware of, is a generation within academia that has regrettably utilized their classroom or their lecture hall as a platform for spewing their very biased form of education and ideology. And so we find ourselves interacting with a generation that, if there is no other alternative, then this is what they're walking away understanding. For me, when I, was a college student, and Paul has probably heard this story for the umpteenth time, and I apologize for it, but growing up, and as you can tell from my last name, my maiden name being Rojas, my late father was Puerto Rican. He was not Jewish. I am part of a generation of what we call hybrid Jews. I recommend you all use that language. It is the popular language today. I think it sounds very positive and environmentally friendly, so I'm all for it. So I'm part of a generation of millennial hybrid Jews, meaning that we have one parent that is not Jewish. In my case, it was my late father of blessed memory. Now, growing up with a hybrid identity, right? Oftentimes, and what we are absolutely seeing today, is that the first opportunity for Jewish students, let's leave non-Jewish students to the side for just a second, but for Jewish students to potentially have this first level of interaction is when they're reaching campus. So for the millennial generation, it is estimated that 48% of Jews my age, so in the millennial age gap, are hybrid, meaning they have one parent that is not Jewish, 48%. That number today is estimated to be 80%. So 80% of Jewish students in the United States specifically come from a background where one parent is not Jewish. Now, I want to give you another number. 17% today of Jewish children under the age of 18, 17% are being educated through a Jewish educational system. Not because of ideological reasons necessarily, but because it is very, very costly. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the cost of a Jewish education. My daughter is here at the Jewish day school here in Rockville, Maryland, a phenomenal school, bilingual. I mean, the biggest blessing, because my Israeli Sabra daughter is now having a Jewish educational experience, but that's another topic we can have a few months from now, and a completely different conversation. But you look at the price tag that is on having a Jewish experience, and so it limits the individuals who can have access to it. So what that brings us forward to is the reality that amongst 400,000, an estimated 400,000 Jewish students on college campuses today, who nearly 80% of them are estimated to come from a home where one parent is not Jewish, their first major opportunity to engage and interact and touch on the topic of Israel, Zionism, Jewish identity at its base is once they walk onto a college campus. Now, if the right individuals are not there to greet them and to, quite frankly, engage with them and grab them and make them feel a part of this conversation, then how are we expected to have these conversations with people who are not Jewish? I'm adding this element in because I want us all to understand that the conversations that we have, where for all of us, it's just so obvious. It is so obvious that allowing someone like Raed Salah to sit around the table of the British Parliament is preposterous. Did you like that, Paul? I used preposterous. That was for you. It's unheard of. It's obscene. It's absolutely unacceptable. But for an 18 or 19-year-old student who, under the understanding of listening to a multitude of narratives in the name of intersectionality and understanding and accepting people from where they're coming from, why not just allow him to speak? What you view as a terrorist is what someone else may view as a freedom fighter, right? So it's about understanding the complexities of the conversation. Now, it's very easy to write it off and say, it's such ignorance. I know a lot of people have said to me, it's a very apathetic generation. It absolutely is not an apathetic generation. On the contrary, there is not an issue of apathy. The issue we're seeing is of the connecting, the engagement. How do you make this issue matter when Israel is viewed? And let's remember the psychology behind all of this. Israel has found itself for decades involved in a war that not only is no less important than the actual physical one that it finds itself needing to protect its borders and its citizens, is the psychological warfare it is involved in. And in the psychological warfare that Israel faces, we are facing asymmetric warfare, where Israel is on the losing end. Because in the image of the tank in front of the small child with the rock, it is a losing battle. It is a losing battle. And amongst a generation that, let's think about it. I want to give you all something that I think I may see by your reactions because everyone is on mute right now. Let's understand every college student today, right, was born after September 11, 2001. And if they weren't born after September 11, 2001, they were 1, 2, or 3 years old when it happened. They have no context. They don't know what the second intifada is. So when someone is screaming, intifada, intifada, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, it literally means nothing to them. It's not because they're apathetic and they don't care. It literally has no context in their life story. I was very young. I was 16 years old on 9/11/2001. I grew up in Long Island City, Queens. I can tell you and sign on it, and Paul knows this is a good friend, 9/11 had the most profound impact on my life. Profound. I have goosebumps right now just repeating it. I remember where I was. I remember what I was wearing. I remember the moment I found out. Everything that happened in the after effect, I remembered. It was the first time in my life where I began, because of what happened, to start to ask deep questions about my own Jewish identity, about Israel, about freedom, about democracy. And then 2 years later, when I became a freshman at university in New York City, and I had a professor that said something that was obscene and preposterous and just unacceptable for me, I said something. But there were others who didn't. And I didn't say something because I had this strong Jewish Zionist background. I didn't, quite frankly. The first time my mother ever stepped foot in Israel was when I was married 10 and a half years ago, right? So I didn't come from a background where I knew anything, but I knew what she was saying was fundamentally wrong, and that's what I challenged. So I think it's critical to understand that while we are facing an uptick, and as you all have probably heard and seen the articles and the report from the ADL, there was an absolute uptick over the past year in anti-Semitic activities in the United States, and we see it playing out many times on college campuses. And this debate, this very conversation that we are having right now, are conversations that are happening in the halls of academia. They are happening in the halls of academia. Where is one crossing the line? What is legitimate versus not legitimate discourse or critique of Israel? When does it come to a point where a Jewish student feels uncomfortable with a portion of a part of their identity that they would like to share with others? And it is about, I think, reminding them not only that they are a part of this conversation. We are at the end of May. May is Jewish Heritage Month in the United States. I didn't know that, quite frankly, for a very long time. I'm not sure how many of you knew that. May is officially Jewish Heritage Month in the United States. And I want to kind of give you all a thought, and then we're happy to open it up for questions. But all the while, we are, absolutely front and center challenging and fighting back and educating about anti-Semitism, about anti-Zionism, about the double standard that Israel is so often being held to, and about these voices that are absolutely extreme and unacceptable. We need to be experiencing a renaissance of Jewish pride, of not just the oy veys, but the oyes. What are we celebrating as a community? What do we want young Jewish people to be a part of? The fact that we have Jewish students who come to us and say, they say that I don't have a place in the conversation with people of color on campus, or with the LGBTQ group on campus, or with the liberals on campus, or the Democrats. And what we need to be reminded of is that so many of these causes today that regrettably, and I say it with a heavy heart, have become so politicized, and boxes have been drawn where individuals are welcome and where they're not welcome, are at the core of the history of the Jewish community, particularly here in America, but in other places. It was Jews who stood up against apartheid in South Africa. Let's look at Nelson's Mandela groups of lawyers, Jewish youth movements in South Africa who were built on that. Let's look at the marches that existed here in this country during the civil rights movement, the murders of Schwerner and Goodman of blessed memory, who fought and literally paid with their lives for the rights of Blacks to vote in the United States. It's not only time to just be exposing the absolute double standard and the hatred that still seeps, but reminding and I think invigorating this generation of understanding who they are, where they have come from, and who we are as a community in order for them to feel confident in educating and engaging others in that. I think we can't have one without the other, because many people, I think, inherently maybe pass on or believe in ideas that are either very subtle or outright anti-Semitic. I don't think it necessarily comes from a place of hatred. There are plenty of people who are spewing hatred and they are consciously doing so, but I think there is also a tremendous amount of ignorance, quite frankly, where we need to ensure that what is being taught and how individuals are being engaged is in a proactive manner, where we as a community are coming back in and framing the story the way that it should be.
Thank you very much, Michelle. That was great. It's been too long since I heard you speak. Thanks so much. That was a really useful look at how this is playing out in practice, the issues facing Jewish students on campus, particularly in the United States, but also elsewhere as well, I'm sure. And I think it's a really interesting point about the role of Jewish identity, I guess, Jewish pride, awareness of even basic awareness of being Jewish and what that means and being part of the community and how that plays out. So we're going to open it to questions. There were a couple already, and I urge you to write questions in as we go. I want to clarify. There was a question very specifically posed to me, which I want to just clarify from Melvin Lipich, who asked about when I was talking about the 3 stages of anti-Zionism, and I talked about the anti-Zionism in the sort of second stage in the early years of the state, the Arab states wanting to destroy Israel, and he says, how do you explain as that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, the Jewish exodus from Arab lands in 1948, when these Jews had no part in the war but were simply Jews? That's an excellent point. It's a very fair point, and I think that the specific case of the Jews in Arab countries is an issue which isn't discussed enough. But I was talking mainly about the role of Arab leaders in the attempts to attack and destroy Israel in 48 and then again in 67. But I agree with you. I agree with you, Melvin. I think that the anti-Zionism that manifested in Arab countries, which led to the expulsion of almost every single Jew in those countries, was absolutely anti-Semitism.
Right, and I think, Paul, sorry not to interject, but
sure.
Yet again, an excellent example of where we see an absolute vacuum in terms of even basic knowledge about the 800, 900,000 plus Jews who were indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa, and the need for proactive, engaging educational sessions and events in communities and on campuses, just to let people, wait, what? You're from, we had our Israel fellow, Yareen, he had a huge online Mimuna event after Pesach. And there were 2,500 students who viewed the video after, and just, there were Jews in Morocco. There are still Jews in Morocco. Wait, not all Jews are European. Where so, and you see again the vacuum where people simply don't know about these events, let alone all of the, the domino effect of what happened in the status of the Jews from those countries, or the lack of status rather. So it was a great point. Okay.
David Behrens asks, how do you deal with the reverse side of the coin, anti-Semites who love Israel? Is the fact that they support, or it is claimed to support, Israel's national security sufficient to absolve them? I have something to say about this, but Michelle, if you want to go first.
I think it's an excellent question, and again, we go back to some of the horseshoe that we're dealing with. So, what we find many times, and I'm very, very careful about what I'm saying and how I'm saying it. I am making no political statement here whatsoever. I'm a registered independent, in case it interests anyone. So I'm literally making no political statement here, but arguably enough, amongst younger people in the United States, particularly because of the current administration, there is a lot of conversation around the topic of white supremacist or more extremist voices on the far right end, potentially having been invigorated during, the near period, and some of them, some of these individuals who hold very strict beliefs. So oftentimes you will see at a gun rally images of Israel or flags of Israel being flown, and that makes a lot of people very uncomfortable, simply because we don't want Israel to become a political issue one way or the other. We want Israel to remain, a topic and an ally across the board. So I think it makes many people very uncomfortable, very uncertain. I think it's oftentimes why you will see there is either a push one way or another for some of the leadership in the Jewish community, sometimes making statements after certain individuals have made commentary about Israel, even if it's favorable. So I think it has put the community in a very, very unique spot. There is a lot of disagreement oftentimes. And by the way, also this was the case, I believe it was the premier of Poland, Paul, that also had some far right beliefs and ideologies, and there were many both in Israel, but in the global Jewish community as well, who didn't necessarily feel comfortable. Even though this individual, I think we had the same case with the premier of Brazil, if it was not very similar, who has very far right leaning when it comes to Israel, is very favorable. So I think indeed it does put many individuals not necessarily at ease, while there are others who say, we should be judging these individuals or dealing with them based on the particular issues at hand and not necessarily holding something against them due to other, ideologies that they may hold.
Right. I think, yeah, it is a really thorny issue, and I actually, it's something I'm actually going to get into a bit more in a couple of weeks. So I'm tempted to not say too much now, just to ensure that people tune in again in a couple of weeks. But I will just say that, just to add to what Michelle said, that we're in a kind of weird time politically across the globe, right, where there is this sort of resurgence of nationalism, often a quite unpleasant and insular and borderline racist, sometimes not even borderline, nationalism in various parts of the world, in parts of Europe. You mentioned Poland, also Hungary, and other places. And unfortunately, some of these leaders, I think wrongly and misguidedly, see Zionism as some kind of representation of the nationalism that they want to, that they aspire to. So we have this awkward situation where you'll have the leader of a country, say in Hungary, who's being very pro-Israel, but the Jews of Hungary don't feel very comfortable with him. So it puts Israel in an awkward situation. I think Israel as a government, as a state, has to tread very carefully, because on the one hand, you don't want to alienate countries that are your friends, especially Israel that doesn't always have so many friends, especially in international forums. On the other hand, if you're going to take a sort of zero tolerance position on anti-Semitism, then that might mean that can come up against realpolitik. So yeah, it's a tricky one. There are some parties in Europe which have such a strong connection to former neo-Nazi or far-right parties that even when they say really nice things about Israel won't deal with them. So the Freedom Party in Austria, which was until quite recently part of the coalition there, is one such party that the foreign minister was actually, the foreign minister of Austria was a part of that party, and Israel, even though they had good relations with the Austrian government, wouldn't meet with the foreign minister because he was a member of this party. So it's a very complicated issue, and I sort of sympathize in a way with Israeli foreign policy people having to negotiate that. There's a good practical question here from Marcel Danon, who I know is contacting us from South Africa, it's for you, Michelle, and he asks, how realistically winnable is the battle on campus? Should we maybe not concentrate on educating our own fellow Jewish students who probably feel Jewish and Zionist, but maybe lack the basic facts to confirm those inner feelings and are unable to stand up to the radical opposition Israel faces on campus?
It's an excellent question. And I think I'm glad that you said what country the question came from, because I think that is very, very pertinent here. The Jewish and Zionist education in South Africa and in Australia in particular, in the Southern Hemisphere, quite frankly, is par excellence, namely because I think there has been an incredible effort and investment in the community of making sure as many Jewish students have access as possible. And I think namely the Jewish youth movements that spread across the political and ideological spectrum have offered countless opportunities for young people to engage in the topic. So I think whereas in a place like South Africa, the battle on campus for hearts and minds very much is in that place of equipping students, I think it is very, very different in the United States, where they may not necessarily be coming in with that already existing within them, in their kitschkis, as we would say in Yiddish, meaning that, you know, it's their first opportunity to engage. So it has to be both. And one thing I do want to say is that the shift that needs to happen, particularly on campus for the younger generation, is going to take time. There is no quick fix. There is absolutely no quick fix. We need to understand and face the reality that our departments of academia have been fueled and invested financially by the millions and millions and millions of dollars to skim the position in one direction, okay? And so in order to move that dial back, both in a civic engagement level, but in terms of academia, it is going to take a lot of time and investment. The good news is that we do see shifts. I'll give you one example, the Ohio State University, which each year has a BDS vote and each year has a BDS resolution. Last year, it was voted down, and not only was it voted down, it was voted down 36 against and 7 in favor of. Now, look at those numbers. Those 36 people, you can be for certain, most of them are not Jewish. And the reason why they have built a relationship with Israel is because there was a professional on that campus ensuring that they had been to Israel and they are going to Israel. There are thousands upon thousands of non-Jewish students that are going to Israel, obviously not right now, and please God, may we know better days once again for us all, but thousands of non-Jewish students who are in Israel, who are the connectors, as we call them, in communities, meaning, individuals who are influential in student governments and the like, coming from all different types of backgrounds, Muslim students who are coming to Israel with their Jewish counterparts for experiences. And we're seeing the shift happen, we're seeing the changes that are in place, but it is something that will involve not only equipping and preparing our Jewish students, but allowing them and engaging them to proactively build relationships and genuine relationships with their non-Jewish counterparts on campus in order to ensure that the discourse that is there is fair, legitimate, and not some of what we've seen in the past.
Great, thank you. So there's a question from James McIntosh, an old friend that I haven't seen for too long, who asks, when people say something anti-Semitic and or anti-Zionist, but they seem more ignorant than malicious, can you recommend any way to respond without making them get defensive?
I think it's a great question. And I think, on the one hand, you know, many people argue, and sometimes I question it too, right? In certain instances, where does the conversation of political correctness potentially run into an area where, you know, there are many people who are concerned to say anything, and that's an honest truth. We find ourselves, it's very funny, as shlichim, as Israeli emissaries, we joke that it is our Israeli chutzpah that gets people to talk, you know, and we find so many times our young emissaries, look here in the United States, it's an election year, it's a huge year. And students don't want to risk losing friends or gaining or whatever it may be. And so oftentimes they won't say anything. They'll say, it's okay. It's also okay to disagree as long as we're respecting one another's thoughts. I've had students come up to our shlichim and whisper something in their ears like, it's the first time I ever felt comfortable saying that, or thank you for saying that, that's what I felt this entire time, or similar things, because they just want to feel comfortable. So I think in an instance like that, where someone is saying something, especially if it's an individual that you have a discourse with and a history with, to say, hey, you know, I'm sure this is not what you intended to say, but this is kind of what I heard there. And I just want you to know how it made me feel. You know, I'll give you all a very kind of similar scenario that I found myself in with a colleague many years ago. Paul knows I lost my father tragically as a result of suicide. And I had a colleague that said something, and she didn't mean it. There was no malintent whatsoever or maliciousness by what she said. She just kind of made a very standoffish comment. And so I approached her afterwards and I said, hey, I just want to share something with you that, you know, maybe you didn't realize, but it's very personal for me. And she said, Michelle, I'm so, and it changed her outlook going forward, right? So oftentimes it's about respecting people from where they're coming from, understand that there may be no malice in what they're saying, and really approaching them in a gentle and respectable manner. And I think 9 times out of 10, they'll appreciate it. And I think oftentimes also utilizing something, you know, a background that they may identify with, and something that, you know, may potentially make them feel uncomfortable if someone were to use it, and gently saying, you know, just as you identify as X, it may make you feel uncomfortable if someone said this or thought this way. Well, that's how I feel as a Jewish person.
Right. That's great. I just add that I think that sometimes people will define themselves as anti-Zionists or claim to be anti-Zionist when in fact they just have a problem with something Israel's doing, or they don't like the government of Israel. And when you engage in a conversation with them and you realize that, and you make them realize that actually, that, you know, as long as they're not, as long as they're within a sort of kind of red lines, which, you know, outside the red lines are Israel doesn't have a right to exist, right? Israel's illegitimate, you know, or the demonization and double standards, the 3 Ds that Sharansky talks about. But if they're just criticizing a policy, they're basically part of the debate. And if you let them know that within Israel itself, Israelis have this debate. You know, we just had, you know, this crazy year of 3 elections, and the country's basically split in 2 on a whole range of issues. And it might be that these people who claim to be anti-Zionists, actually, if you discuss with them, they'll realize that they actually hold views which are held by many Israelis who define themselves as Zionists. Which I think that's also part of the, you know, Israel's a democracy. I think that's the important thing. Right?
Absolutely. And it's a learning opportunity for people, right?
Exactly. And this is a country and a society which thrives on debate, and where, you know, you get in a taxi and the taxi driver will tell you his politics, whether you want them or not. And that's you know, that's the way it is.
Be fair, Paul. They hold the best advice. They are your doctors, your lawyers, your marriage counselor. I mean, you know, it is the best return on your buck, or your shekel in this case, that anyone will ever get. But I think, you know, it's a brilliant point, right? Even something like that. Someone once said they want to make taxi diary confessions Israel style, because it exposes so much of Israeli society with all of its mishugana, but in everything that is good about it. I remember once in conversation with a friend telling them about, do you remember that really horrifically just disgusting and unhygienic, the garbage truck protest a few years back, when they lined up the garbage trucks in front of the prime minister's house, and there was garbage all over the shuk, and garbage had not been, and everyone was some of the garbage, and I remember like sending someone the video of like the garbage truck drivers dancing on top, and he was like, that is bananas crazy, but it's the most entertaining thing I've seen in a long time. And he said, I would never have thought of Israel that way. And it was crazy, but it was the way this person put a human face to Israel, and not a headline, and not just, you know, this title that's popping up on their social media, but these are real people. This is a democracy. You know, there's social movements, there's everything else, and it is critical that we use those points for educational opportunities.
Absolutely, absolutely right. We're running a little late, but I want to ask one more question that's been asked, and Michelle, if you can keep the answer reasonably short, from Eliyahu, who asks, isn't the academic establishment, including administrators, responsible for a lot of the anti-Israel and anti-Jewish mood on campus?
It's a great question. So if we're looking in particular here in North America, there are nearly 4,000 institutions of higher learning, from community colleges to state colleges to city, private, Ivy League, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it differs from place to place. Many of you will remember that most recently, Hanukkah, President Trump signed into order an executive order dealing very much front and center with this issue. There was a lot of debate and conversation around that. It's important to note, by the way, the executive order, the draft of the executive order, is something that actually began all the way back to the Bush administration, ran through the Obama administration, and got its final seal and stamp of approval under the Trump administration. Very important knowledge for everyone to understand. It was not a political issue at all. It very much became a political issue, but it was not in its drafting and in its intent. It was very much to respond to the fact that the conversation and discourse had gone to a very unhealthy place, regrettably, on certain college campuses. So the federal government is, where it's allowed to, in institutions of higher learning that do receive federal funding, keeping monitor of these issues, rightfully so. Any form of hatred or bias should not be allowed in an institute of higher learning. Where it becomes more problematic are private institutions or institutions that do not receive federal funding. And of course, you know, the famous amendments, right? The Constitution. Many people say that under the amendment of freedom of speech, that all forms of freedom of speech should be protected. But there's also, as we say in Hebrew, sechel yashar, using your common sense and understanding and not tolerating that hatred that would never be tolerated against any other minority group should not be tolerated against Jews. And I think more and more we are seeing administration and faculty that is either pro-Israel or just wants fair-minded debate coming forward, and we will continue to work with those individuals. But once again, it is amongst the topics that will take some time to absolutely move the dial because of all that has been done on the opposite end for so long.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I hope it's been interesting and informative and useful for you all. And I'm going to send you, I'll send everyone here and other people details of next week's we've got an event, we've got a lecture next week and also in 2 weeks' time. And I'll send you those details. I might be a little late with sending it because of the Shavuot holiday, which starts tomorrow evening, but that will come to you, and you can also find out the information on Facebook and on our website. So thank you all. Good afternoon or good night, and I'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.